Hi, I'm Eric Jurgensen, a hobbyist blacksmith based in Oklahoma City. Welcome to my basement shop. This is the second in a series of videos on using induction heating to do blacksmith forging. A tool like this 3/8 inch diameter fuller is an ideal project for induction heating. I've pressed the pedal to get this going. You can see the oil burning off the end. I try not to get my head over that. Don't really want to breathe much of it. So in about 20 seconds we've gotten this up to heat. Let's get it over the anvil. I'm thinning the bar to 3/8 of an inch in one dimension to get the shape of the fuller roughed in. Look at the length of that heat. It's enough, but just barely for what I'm doing. With my coil, that's the length that gets heated with the bar sitting still in the coil. My next step is to heat it at the 6-inch mark so I can cut it off using my Hardy. My total heating time for this is about 34 seconds instead of the 20 seconds it took to heat the end. That's because there's metal on either side of the heat drawing heat out. The length of heat is nearly ideal for a cutting operation. Now I need to taper the struck end. Notice that I'm holding the bar only part way through the coil. As with a coal forge, it's very easy to get a short heat on the end of a bar. And then a final heat to add the indexing so I can feel the alignment of the tool from the shape in my hand. As you've seen, the process of using the induction heater for this is very intuitive. Tools of this general shape are very conducive to induction heating. Next up is heat treating. Note that with this coil I just can't get a long enough heat for annealing, so I will skip to the hardening. I did rough grinding with 40 grit, then did a successive 120, 220 grit polish, and now I'm ready for heat treating. I'm using full blast heating here, and I'm trying to carefully get it to cherry red. I'm going to grab my magnet as we get close. Still slightly magnetic. A little bit more, on and off to try to get this just so. Don't want to overshoot it or I'll get more grain growth than I'd like. There we are, off to the bucket. I also harden the struck end of my tools. This hammer is soft. I don't strike these ends with a hardened hammer. On this pass, I'm using a different technique. I'm deliberately turning down the induction heater so that it will not heat so quickly. I find this is actually a very handy way to do it. So bringing it down to about 300 here. I'm going to find that that's not quite enough, and I'll be bringing it up to about 400. This allows me to soak it longer, to get a more even heat, and to not risk overrunning quite so much. As you can see, I can extend the stock slightly and check the magnetic state without interrupting the heating very much. A slight advantage over a fire. Now I'm going to go up to 400 to finish the heating. 300 was good because it allowed me to soak it. 400 will get me to cherry red, non-magnetic, and then it's time for the bucket. For the struck end, I'm using retained heat to do the tempering. So right now I am scraping it off so I can see the temper colors run. I had enough heat to run the colors twice, but since this is not terribly exciting footage of my head, we'll just skip the second time. Now for tempering the business end, I'm going to use reduced heat. So instead of full scale, I'm going to turn this down to about 200. Now to find out what it's at, I'm going to press the foot pedal, bring it down to 200. After the hardening, I took it back to the grinder and did a 220 grit polish on it so that I could easily see the colors running. So let's put this in here, again at the 200 setting. I'm starting to see some yellow, so I'm going to let off the foot pedal. And now off to the bucket. This butcher with side stops is a single taper more than 3 inches in length. The coil is only 1.5 inches long. I used 2 heats to rough it in, but now I'm wanting a single heat for blending and finishing. I'm moving the stock back and forth to get the heat I want. This approach is inefficient due to heat loss and can produce a somewhat uneven heat, but is adequate for most purposes. Notice that I'm focusing the heat on the thicker part of the stock. Then I'll move to the thinner part of the stock and get it up to heat. The thicker part won't lose heat quite as fast because it's thicker. Then I'll just kind of top off the heat on the thicker part of the stock and call that good. For this operation at least, a longer coil would be nice. Heat treating an edge tool is surprisingly tricky. The small thin edge doesn't get as much heat as the larger mass behind it, yet it has significantly more surface to radiate heat away. I found that I had to get most of the end of this butcher to an orange heat just to get the edge to cherry red. To deal with this problem, I've placed this butcher against a piece of 3/8 inch by 1 inch flat stock. This provides heat and effectively insulates on one side. Making tong jaws, I find the 1.5 inch heat very satisfactory. When roughing out reins like this, I find that I'd like a bit longer heat. As you can see, I'm running out of hammering while I still have a lot of heat. And when I'm doing the final squaring, I want a much longer heat. These wizard bottle openers require a trick to handle the loop at the bottom.
At this point, heating's become an interesting problem. The loop is getting too big to go in here. But I found that I can hold it right here against the edge, and the magnetic lines of flux still go through it pretty strongly, and I can heat it up.
Heating some sheet metal makes it very clear what's happening with this heating pattern. Watch the edge. It will heat up first. That's because there's less metal around it to draw the heat away. But the big takeaway is, look at the heating pattern. It's a donut. It heats near those edges, but it doesn't heat quite so much in the middle. This makes some projects possible even when the stock doesn't fit. I love forge welding with induction heat. I just flip down my number 3 welding shades to protect my eyes from infrared damage and watch for the scale to melt. It's much easier to see than in a coal forge. With mild steel, I don't bother with flux. There, the scale is starting to melt. At this point, it's ready to weld. Here is a fluxless lap weld of 3/8 inch round stock. I'm holding the scarves together so they'll heat more quickly and more evenly. I'm not going to do a full weld here, just show how easy it is to do the initial sticking. Notice that we've reached the temperature of rapid scaling. Now the scale is starting to melt on the bottom piece. If I had a third hand, this would be a great time to turn down the heat and let things even out. Or even just let off the pedal for a second. Now the top has reached welding heat. I'm pushing and working the scarves together a bit. The scarves are now fused enough that the piece can be handled as a single unit. My welds have proven fairly serviceable. As you can see, the faggot weld shown previously is strong enough to handle thinning into the bowl of this flux spoon. On the other hand, this lap weld was tested to destruction and it broke along the weld. It was certainly strong enough for ornamental work, but it obviously did not reach parent stock strength like a fully mature weld. I think a hotter welding heat would resolve that. I now have supplies for making coils, so keep an eye on this channel for information on coil making and a resolution of my welding question. In the meantime, as blacksmith Jim Koch says, forge on and make beautiful things.